2009. It's whenever the 12th offering from Megadeth was recorded and released to us, the public. And until November the 1st, 2011, 2 years later, it will be the last part of the Megadeth discography. Of course, that's going to be changing within a matter of days, but that's not the point. The point is that Endgame was the endgame for this discography until, of course, 13 arrives. And strangely enough, it was an album that was strangely marked by being one of the very first reviews that I ever did. It's funny, whenever I started this whole reviewing game back in 2009, after about 4 or 5 months of reviewing, I think I'd only done about 10 to 15, maybe 20 at the most. So Megadeth's Endgame ended up being one of the very first reviews that coverkillernation ever did. Of course, back under the name Coverkiller. This album is a unique case. Whenever it was released, as I mentioned a little bit previously in the United Abominations video, I enjoyed this more than United Abominations, and I felt it to be vastly superior and United Abominations to be a poor album. Now, 2 years later, it's weird how the aging process really causes you to think a little bit more clearly and potentially shift your opinions around a little bit. It's almost like asking me 3 different times in my life what my favorite Megadeth albums were in order from 1 to 5. Something that would have shifted all 3 times. And it has. With Endgame, it's an album of consistency, and this is an album that definitely boasts a consistency all its own. It's a quick little release at a little bit over 40 minutes in length. It's not quite as quick as some of the eldest scrolls in the Megadeth discography from the 1980s. However, for this modern age, these albums around this length seem to be relatively commonplace. However, on this album, there's something a little bit different as opposed to United Abominations, The System Has Failed, etc. And that's the fact that this is the first album of this new era that whenever I listen to it now, as opposed to then, where I might have just been hot on the record because it was new Megadeth. This is an album that feels strangely just average to slightly above average, as opposed to being the standout that I thought it was in the year 2009. It's kind of a strange scenario to really recap and revisit albums from the past and notice that your feelings about them have shifted slightly. It's an album where whenever I listen to it even today, there's just not very much that stands out in front of me. With United Abominations the second time around, and any other time around in the most recent memory ever before I did the review of it, I was able to really highlight and select certain songs that really spoke to me, that really gave me a lot of reason to really enjoy the album. With Endgame, it's a little bit of a slightly different story. Instead, it's an album that I speak about to you kind of in its entirety whenever I boast about certain elements of the music. This is an entirety album as opposed to a specific track standout record. And that can be a good thing, don't get me wrong, but it could also be a bad thing, and I'll explain to you why very briefly. It could be a good thing if the whole entire album is extremely solid and extremely mind-blowing, and it's very difficult to discern something specific in order to really focus in on that. And good examples of that are on the perfect albums such as Agaloc's The Mantle or Faith No More's The Real Thing. However, whenever I think of Endgame by Megadeth, I think more along the lines of a consistent, overall, slightly above average record. This is actually, in my opinion, the first real hiccup in this little stretch that has been going on since 2004, the revitalization, the rebirth of the thrash-style Megadeth. There are still the same consistencies that you hear on the previous 2 albums before this one. There's still very good dual thrash attacks, there's very good lyrics, however, there's a little bit of a difference here. They're not quite as searing, they're not quite as harsh, and the topicality of them has shifted as well. It seemed on an album like United Abominations, Dave was really honed in on this topic of America, the United Nations, and all the things that were really going wrong with the country. Almost as though taking a Dave for President approach, and this album was his principal campaign. With an album such as Endgame, it's a little bit of a different scenario. In 2009, we had a new president, which means that the policies and the way in which our government was running was slightly different, if only minutely different. However, the names in charge and at the helm were different enough that the status quo for Dave's lyric writing had shifted a little bit. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing. You got to really branch out. At the same time, though, this seems to be lacking something in some points. There are some excellent melodies. The songcraft is still very, very strong. It just seems a little bit like the overall flow of this album flows very mediocrely. Almost as though whenever they wrote this album, it was done so in a way in which the shift and everything caused a little bit of a lack of focus. The focus was there, everything was there. It just doesn't seem to be as strong. Endgame will go down as one of these albums that, if this was the last album in Megadeth's discography, many people would think of it as almost an oversight, you know what I mean? It's still a very good record. It definitely beats out albums such as Risk, but at the same time, people will view it as just kind of there and existing, kind of like the Final Cut by Pink Floyd from the discography that is upcoming. It's an album that by itself is probably the worst in Pink Floyd's discography, but at the same time, if that had been the last album in Pink Floyd's discography, as opposed to the other two David Gilmour-led band albums came after it, then the Final Cut would be an obscure album that hardly anybody cared about. I don't think Endgame would quite suffer that fate. It still does have some standout moments. It still is a Megadeth record that does boast very, very good moments, and it's not an album that is going to go down in history as a massive, massive flop. In fact, if anything, there have been more fans that have flocked in. The problem with it is that they flocked in on an album that is not one of Megadeth's strongest. So instead, their exploration of their past discography will lead them to more gems and lead them to more promises. More ideas of what Megadeth should be from this point out, and they'll actually start having opinions, much like most of our longtime Megadeth veterans. That said, ladies and gentlemen, the Megadeth discography for now is over. Okay, let's face it. Y'all know by now that I've recorded this after 13. So, sequence, fuck it. 13 is coming, 13 is here, 13 review is after this. You probably want to click on it. I think you should do it. Find out where Dave and the boys went after Endgame. Is 13 reflecting back to the earlier albums of this recent thrash run? Or does Endgame continue on 13? Just how unlucky is 13? Find out.